Soldering with Frankenken and his son. Let's look at ways to solder a Frankenso. The cheapest way to do this is hand solder. If you're into car electronics, you should have a soldering iron, so all you need is good flux and solder, and if you can't see that well, some magnification. And even though the Frankenso looks complicated, it's not really much more than a Frankenstein, with some extras. The Frankenso looks daunting, because there looks like there's a lot of parts, but it's actually not much more than a Frankenstein. These parts down here are an onboard STM32, so you don't need them if you have a discovery board. If you look at these MOSFETs here on the Frankenstein, the MOSFETs and resistors are here on the Frankenso. These ones here are over here, so there's just an extra one. If you go to the back, these ones and all the resistors and diodes, they're all here. This one is over here. The SD cards. So if you look at it, it's just this power supply that's different, maybe this wireless, and other bits and pieces. Basically it's something like 200 parts versus 300 parts, so it's more time than difficult. The other option is solder paste and heat. One method is to use my DIY stencil idea and a hot air gun and do small sections at a time. The price of a hot air station isn't that bad, and even the 2-in-1 isn't much more. This will be faster than hand soldering. The other option is the usual toaster oven. I got this one at a flea market for $10. Another option is hot plate soldering, but if you think about it, it's just a dedicated stovetop, and I found one of these dumped on the street. Let's try some 3-year-old solder paste in the oven. The solder paste had hardened and was made liquid again by adding some IPA. Here we are at 50 degrees Celsius, 100 degrees Celsius. You can just see it going from matte grey to getting a bit of a silver on top. The oven took about 15 minutes from dead cold to molten solder, which is good because it does a dry out preheat of the solder paste. And it turns the solder around 175 degrees Celsius. Let's now try a stovetop. Here is 50 degrees C. This thing is fast, actually too fast for a preheat, hence the bubbling. The 10-minute preheat is supposed to boil out all the liquids so it doesn't bubble. So if you're using a stove, you have to preheat it for 10 minutes at a lower setting before turning it up to melt the solder. At about 6 minutes and 115 degrees Celsius, it's turned to solder. The oven looks okay. The stove was okay, but probably needs a preheat. The conclusion is stovetops work, but they're very fast. And if you have an open element like this, it's going to be even faster. So you'll have to put it on a low setting for a preheat for 10 minutes before soldering. The other problem is flatness and size. But you can use a flat frying pan or dish, and maybe throw some cheap eBay flux in there to aid in even heat transfer to the whole PCB. This idea is going to work fine for a Frankenstein, but it won't work for a Frankenso because it has parts on both sides and won't sit flat on a dish. Hot plates are a good idea because you can easily see every corner if it's been soldered, and I might try doing another Frankenstein board just for an experiment. Next I'm going to test different solder pastes to see if one is better than the other. The first one is Mechanic Old. It was over 3 years old and had hardened, so I had to add about 10 drops of IPA to make it liquid again. The second one is the same Mechanics Old, but with good flux added. It's the American flux that I found worked a lot better than the eBay fluxes. The third is another eBay solder paste. Heaven knows how you pronounce it, XOREDX. And the fourth one is Chem Tools. This is from my local electronics shop and the most expensive. All of these solder pastes are 63% tin and 37% lead, because leaded usually makes shinier joints. To the bat cave. The big blobs of paste spread out too much, so I had to put these smaller blobs on. This is 50 degrees C, 100 degrees C, and the pastes are spreading out. I was a bit slow to catch it with the camera, but it went to solder about 120 degrees C. I can't say there was a bad solder paste. The Mechanic Old was the worst, but it was 3-year-old, hardened and softened up with IPA. Even then it did kind of work. The Mechanic Old with added good flux didn't work. There were so little volume solids with the flux and the IPA added that there wasn't much left after they vapoured off. The Exoed X and Chem Tools were so close it was hard to tell. Maybe the Chem Tools is better, but I'd be happy with either. Now it comes down to whether we apply the solder paste by hand. This is going to be slower and will need practice, because if it isn't controlled, you'll bridge fine pitch pins. Or we can go the expensive stencil. Just click SMT stencil, quote now, add a Gerber. You have to download the RusEFI master from the GitHub. Go to hardware, down in Frankenso Gerbers. Now on my PCB it says 5.3, so I assume it's this one. Select. It says $8.70 plus $21 registered here. Oddly enough, if you buy two stencils, like I would like a Frankenstein as well, they won't combine postage. So you're paying $30 for this one, and you're paying another $30 for the next one. Either way, I'm not paying another $30 for another stencil, so we're going to have to learn how to do the other Frankenstein by hand. See how all these little things add up when you DIY for yourself? And when you add it all up, it ends up costing more than getting one already pre-soldered. Stencil's on the way, so we wait.